November 15th, 1945. The desert sun hung low over the Nevada horizon as a convoy of military trucks rolled eastward along Highway 91, carrying 32 Japanese prisoners of war from their internment camp near Tonopah toward a new facility in the Colorado River Valley. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, formerly of the Imperial Navy, sat in the back of the lead truck, his hands no longer bound. Watching the endless expanse of sagebrush and sand pass by the canvas flaps, he had spent 3 years imagining what defeat would look like, had prepared himself for execution or lifelong imprisonment in conditions matching the harshest stories told about Allied treatment of captives. What he could not have prepared for was the journey he was about to take through a city that would shatter every assumption he held about the nation that had defeated his empire. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Yamamoto and his fellow prisoners were about to witness would transform their understanding, not just of their captors, but of the very nature of the industrial and economic power that had overwhelmed the forces of Japan. In the span of 2 hours driving through a single American city, they would see more electric lights than existed in all of Tokyo. More abundance than they had known was possible, and a display of civilian prosperity that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The convoy had left Camp Tonopah at 1400 hours, scheduled to arrive at the Colorado River facility by nightfall. Captain Robert Henderson, the convoy commander, had initially planned a direct route through the desert, avoiding population centers entirely. But mechanical troubles with 2 of the trucks had delayed their departure by 6 hours, and Henderson made a decision that would inadvertently create one of the most psychologically impactful moments of cultural exchange in the Pacific War's aftermath. Rather than risk a dangerous night drive through the open desert, he would take the prisoners through Las Vegas, where they could stop briefly for vehicle maintenance, while the city's lights provided safe passage. Henderson had no idea what Las Vegas meant in 1945. The war had transformed this dusty railroad town into something unprecedented in human history. The construction of Hoover Dam had brought thousands of workers and millions of dollars. The military had established Nellis Air Force Base just northeast of the city, bringing more personnel and more money. But it was the unique Nevada decision to legalize gambling in 1931, combined with the wartime economic boom, that had turned Las Vegas into a blazing beacon of electric excess in the middle of nowhere. Sergeant First Class James Mitchell rode in the truck with Yamamoto and 7 other Japanese prisoners. Mitchell had fought in the Solomon Islands campaign, had seen the desperate conditions of Japanese forces in the final year of the war, had watched enemy soldiers emerge from caves so malnourished they could barely walk. Now he was escorting them across the American West, and he noticed something that troubled him. These men, even after months of adequate food and medical care, still carried the hollowed look of people who had known true deprivation. They spoke little, asked for nothing, and seemed perpetually braced for cruelty that never came. Yamamoto had been captured on Okinawa in June of 1945. As a naval officer, he had received extensive education about the United States, had studied their military capabilities, knew the theoretical numbers of their industrial production. But theory and reality were different things. In his experience, Americans were well equipped and numerous, but he had assumed this was the result of stripping their civilian economy bare, of mobilizing every resource for war as Japan had done. The entire Japanese home front had been reduced to near starvation conditions to feed the military machine. Surely, Yamamoto reasoned, America had done the same, only more efficiently given their larger population base. The convoy passed through Henderson, a small community just southeast of Las Vegas. As the sun touched the western mountains, the prisoners noticed something immediately. Even in this small town, every building seemed to have electric lights, not just government buildings or military facilities, but ordinary homes, small shops, even decorative lights strung between poles. Yamamoto counted more electric bulbs on a single residential street than he had seen in an entire block of Tokyo before the war. Then, as the trucks rounded a curve and began the final approach into Las Vegas proper, the prisoners saw something that made several of them gasp audibly, despite their disciplined silence. The entire horizon ahead of them was glowing, not the diffuse glow of a city, but concentrated rivers of light that seemed impossible in their brightness and extent. Henderson had ordered the convoy to proceed down Fremont Street, the main artery, through downtown Las Vegas. It was the most direct route to the maintenance depot where the troubled trucks could be serviced. What he did not consider was what Fremont Street had become in November 1945. The war had just ended 3 months earlier. Rationing had ceased. Celebration was still in the air. And every casino, every hotel, every business on Fremont Street was ablaze with lights that had been dimmed or extinguished during wartime blackout regulations. The Golden Nugget Casino had installed a new neon sign in October, replacing the subdued wartime lighting with 60,000 individual bulbs arranged in patterns that moved and danced. The Pioneer Club, which had opened in 1942, had just unveiled Vegas Vic, a 40-foot-tall neon cowboy that waved mechanically at passing traffic. The Horseshoe Club Binions, the Las Vegas Club, the Northern Club. Every establishment competed to outdo its neighbors in luminous excess. Yamamoto stood up in the truck bed, ignoring protocol, staring at the spectacle around him. Other prisoners did the same. Mitchell, who should have ordered them to sit, found himself unable to issue the command. He saw their faces, saw the confusion and shock and something approaching disbelief. And he understood that he was witnessing something profound. One of the prisoners, a former army corporal named Kenji Tanaka, began to weep silently. Yamamoto glanced at him, saw tears running down the man's face as he stared at the lights. When Yamamoto spoke to him quietly in Japanese, Tanaka replied in a voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of a man's worldview collapsing. What Tanaka had said was simple. They did not even need to try. The convoy moved slowly through the downtown district, delayed by traffic that seemed impossibly dense for such a small city. Yamamoto began to notice details that disturbed him even more than the lights. The cars were everywhere, hundreds of them, most appearing new or well-maintained. In Tokyo, private automobile ownership had been almost non-existent even before the war. Here, in a desert town that could not have had more than 20,000 permanent residents, cars filled every street. The people walking the sidewalks looked well-fed, healthy, their clothing clean and intact. Yamamoto saw women in dresses that had clearly not been patched or mended, men in suits that fit properly, children eating ice cream cones from a shop whose window display showed more food than his entire unit had seen in the final months on Okinawa. But it was the lights that dominated everything. The sheer quantity of electricity being consumed for pure decoration, for entertainment, for excess, spoke to an industrial capacity that Yamamoto had never truly grasped. Japan had mobilized every factory, had stripped copper from civilian use, had rationed electricity so severely that cities went dark at night. And here, in a place so insignificant it had not even been marked on the maps he had studied at Naval Academy. The Americans were burning enough electricity to power a city of millions, just to make colored lights dance in the desert. The truck stopped at a maintenance depot on the edge of the casino district. Henderson ordered the prisoners to remain in the vehicles while mechanics examined the troubled trucks. The stop stretched from 15 minutes to 45 as a more serious mechanical issue was discovered and repaired. During that time, the prisoners sat in the truck beds, surrounded by the glowing excess of Las Vegas at night, and processed what they were seeing. Yamamoto found himself in conversation with another officer prisoner, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura, who had commanded a submarine until its capture near the Philippines. Nakamura had a degree in economics from Waseda University and had served in the Naval Ministry before the war. He understood industrial production, had seen the classified reports on American manufacturing capacity, had read the intelligence assessments that predicted Japan's defeat based purely on numerical analysis. Nakamura spoke quietly, his words carefully chosen. He explained that he had thought those numbers were exaggerated, propaganda meant to demoralize Japanese forces. Now, seeing this obscure desert town casually burning enough electricity to light several Japanese cities, he understood that the numbers had been accurate, more than accurate, conservative. The United States had produced 300,000 aircraft during the war years. Japan had produced 76,000. The United States had built a navy that exceeded the combined fleets of the rest of the world. Nakamura's voice held no bitterness as he explained this to Yamamoto, only stunned acceptance. The war had been lost before the first shot was fired, lost to an economic disparity so vast that no amount of determination could bridge it. Another prisoner, a young private named Ichiro Sato, who had been conscripted only months before the war's end, asked a question that had been troubling him. If America had this much wealth, this much abundance, why had they even bothered fighting? Why not simply ignore Japan's expansion in China and the Pacific? Yamamoto had no good answer. The question revealed an assumption that had underlain much of Japanese military thinking, that America was soft, pleasure-loving, unwilling to sacrifice for distant strategic interests. Las Vegas was certainly proof of the first two qualities, but the fact that America had mobilized its vast industrial might to fight a war on two fronts simultaneously, while maintaining this level of civilian abundance, suggested that the third assumption had been catastrophically wrong. The convoy resumed its journey after an hour's stop. As the trucks pulled away from downtown Las Vegas, heading east toward the Colorado River, the lights slowly faded behind them until the desert night reasserted its darkness. But the memory of those lights remained, burned into the consciousness of every prisoner who had witnessed them. Mitchell noticed that the prisoners were more communicative afterward, asking occasional questions through the Japanese-speaking interpreter who traveled with the convoy. They wanted to know if Las Vegas was typical of American cities. When told that it was actually quite unusual, that most cities did not have such extravagant lighting, they seemed almost relieved. Then Mitchell made the mistake of mentioning that places like New York and Chicago were much larger, with far more lights in total, just spread across greater areas. The prisoners fell silent again. The convoy reached its destination at 2300 hours. The Colorado River facility was a standard prisoner-of-war camp, well maintained according to Geneva Convention requirements, but certainly not luxurious. The prisoners were processed through intake procedures, assigned to barracks, given their orientation briefing. Yamamoto performed all these activities mechanically, his mind still processing what he had seen. That night, lying on his bunk in the darkened barracks, Yamamoto found himself recalculating every strategic assessment he had ever made. The Pacific War had been framed to Japanese forces as a necessary conflict against an enemy that sought to strangle Japan's access to resources. They had been told that America, while wealthy, was weak-willed and divided, that a series of sharp defeats would break their resolve and lead to a negotiated peace that recognized Japan's regional dominance. But Las Vegas had revealed a different truth. America was not at the limit of its resources. It had never approached the limit. The abundance casually displayed in that desert city suggested that the wartime mobilization had been only a partial effort, that vast reserves of industrial capacity had never needed to be fully tapped. Japan had spent every drop of strength in its final defense. America had prevailed while maintaining the ability to light up empty desert for entertainment. Over the following weeks and months at the Colorado River camp, Yamamoto and his fellow prisoners received regular news about the occupation of Japan. They learned about the food shipments being sent to prevent mass starvation, about the rebuilding efforts, about the surprisingly humane treatment of the Japanese population by occupation forces. These reports were initially met with skepticism. Surely they were propaganda meant to make the prisoners more compliant. But then letters began arriving from families in Japan. The letters were censored, of course, but the information that came through was consistent. American forces were providing food, medicine, and aid on a scale that seemed incomprehensible. The letters described American soldiers sharing rations with hungry children, military engineers rebuilding infrastructure, medical personnel treating Japanese civilians with the same care they gave to their own troops. Yamamoto received a letter from his younger sister in Nagasaki. She described the devastation from the atomic device, the horror beyond anything she could adequately convey. But then she wrote about American military doctors who had come to treat survivors, who worked day and night to save people from a weapon their own country had deployed. She could not understand it. Yamamoto, thinking of the lights of Las Vegas, thought perhaps he was beginning to. The psychological impact of that night drive through Las Vegas rippled through the prisoner population in unexpected ways. A study group formed, prisoners who wanted to understand how America had achieved such industrial might. The camp commander, recognizing an opportunity for rehabilitation and education, provided books and arranged lectures on American economic history, industrial organization, and civic structure. These were not soft prisoners, grateful for capture. Many had fought ferociously, had believed deeply in their cause, had been prepared to give their lives rather than surrender. But they were also intelligent men capable of reassessing their understanding when confronted with incontrovertible evidence. Nakamura, the economics-trained submarine commander, became particularly influential in these study sessions. He explained concepts that helped his fellow prisoners understand what they had seen. He talked about American resource abundance, about the vast fertile territory that could feed hundreds of millions, about the industrial development that had accelerated through the late 1800s and early 1900s, about economic systems that incentivized innovation and efficiency. But more than the economics, Nakamura emphasized the psychology. America had fought the war as a nation that expected to win, expected to survive, expected to return to prosperity afterward. Las Vegas proved that civilian morale had never truly been threatened, that the home front had maintained confidence throughout the conflict. Japan had fought the war as a nation that knew it might not survive, that had mobilized every resource in a desperate gamble, that had asked its people to sacrifice everything with no guarantee of victory. The difference, Nakamura argued, was not just in resources or strategy. It was in the fundamental nature of the two societies' relationship with modernity and industrial development. America had embraced industrialization early and completely, had built systems that created wealth broadly across society, had developed civic institutions that channeled prosperity into public goods. Japan had industrialized later and more narrowly, had concentrated wealth and power in military and zaibatsu structures, had never fully developed the civic framework that made industrial abundance translate into widespread prosperity. Not all prisoners accepted this analysis. Some maintained that Japan had been defeated by treachery, by the atomic devices that violated all codes of honorable warfare, by America's willingness to target civilians with area attacks. But even these critics had trouble dismissing what they had seen in Las Vegas. The lights were not a weapon. They were simply existence, the ordinary backdrop of American civilian life, even in an insignificant desert town. Yamamoto found himself changing in ways he had not anticipated. He began to see the war not as a tragic necessity, but as a catastrophic miscalculation based on fundamental misunderstanding of the opponent. The military leadership that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack had known America's industrial statistics, but had not understood what those statistics meant in practical terms. They had calculated ratios of production, but had not grasped the psychological and social implications of a society wealthy enough to waste resources on pure spectacle. The camp had a program of voluntary repatriation education designed to prepare prisoners for return to occupied Japan. Yamamoto enrolled, studied English intensively, learned about democratic systems and free market economics. He was not alone. By spring of 1946, more than two-thirds of the prisoners in the Colorado River facility were participating in educational programs, preparing themselves to contribute to a rebuilt Japan that would need to learn from its defeat. The letters from home grew more frequent and more hopeful. The occupation was not the brutal subjugation that had been feared. General Douglas MacArthur was overseeing a transformation of Japanese society, instituting democratic reforms, breaking up the old power structures, investing in rebuilding. The letters described abundance beginning to flow into Japan, American food aid preventing the mass starvation that had seemed inevitable in the war's immediate aftermath. Yamamoto's sister wrote in March 1946 about American Quakers who had established a care center in Nagasaki, providing food and medical treatment without proselytizing or demanding anything in return. She described American soldiers helping to clear rubble, sharing chocolate with children, treating Japanese people with basic human dignity that contrasted sharply with how Japanese forces had treated occupied populations in China and Southeast Asia. These reports forced another reckoning among the prisoners. They had fought for an empire that had committed atrocities. they were only now learning about in full detail. The camp received newspapers and magazines, no longer censored as heavily now that the war was over. The accounts of Japanese actions in Nanking, in the Philippines, in prisoner-of-war camps throughout the occupied territories, were undeniable and horrifying. Some prisoners retreated into denial or silence. Others, like Yamamoto, chose to confront the reality that they had served a cause that was not just defeated, but morally wrong. This was not easy acceptance. It required dismantling identity and purpose, acknowledging complicity in great evil, and finding a way to continue existing with that knowledge. The lights of Las Vegas became a kind of reference point in these difficult conversations. Nakamura used them as a metaphor in one memorable discussion. He argued that just as Las Vegas casually displayed abundance that exceeded Japanese imagination, so too had America demonstrated moral capacity that exceeded what many Japanese had believed possible in warfare. The same nation that had developed atomic weapons had also sent food to feed its enemies' children. The same military that had brought down Japanese cities was now rebuilding them. This paradox was possible, Nakamura suggested, because American power came from excess capacity, excess industrial capacity, excess wealth, excess confidence, that allowed for generosity even toward defeated enemies. Not everyone found this explanation satisfying. It seemed to excuse too much, to overlook the atomic devices and area attacks that had caused hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. But it provided a framework for understanding the occupation's surprising character, for making sense of the disconnect between the brutal end of the war and the relatively humane beginning of the peace. Yamamoto began writing letters to his sister that tried to explain what he had seen and how it had changed his thinking. He described the drive through Las Vegas in detail, trying to convey not just the visual spectacle, but its implications. He wrote about the education he was receiving, about his intention to return to Japan and contribute to building a society that could eventually achieve similar prosperity through peaceful means. His sister's responses revealed that similar transformations were occurring throughout occupied Japan. The population was exhausted, traumatized, grieving for losses that could never be restored, but they were also pragmatic, capable of recognizing that the occupation was nothing like what they had been led to expect, and beginning to see opportunity in the democratic and economic reforms being instituted. The prisoners at the Colorado River camp were not mistreated, but neither were they pampered. They worked, maintained the facility, participated in educational programs, and waited for repatriation. The work was not punitive. They maintained their own barracks, helped with food preparation, performed groundskeeping duties. The Americans seemed to view prisoner labor as part of a normal routine rather than as exploitation or punishment. This casual normality was itself psychologically significant. The prisoners were not treated as dangerous enemies who needed to be constantly monitored and suppressed. They were treated as temporarily detained individuals who would eventually return home. This assumption of eventual return to normal life contrasted with the Japanese military's approach to captured American personnel, who had been treated as eternal enemies deserving of harsh treatment. By summer of 1946, repatriation began in earnest. Prisoners were processed in groups, given travel documents, provided with some civilian clothing, and transported to ports where ships would carry them back to Japan. Yamamoto's group was scheduled for August departure, meaning he would return to Japan just over a year after his capture on Okinawa. As the repatriation date approached, Yamamoto found himself reflecting on the strange trajectory his life had taken. He had been an officer in the Imperial Navy, had believed deeply in the mission he served, had expected to die defending Japan from invasion. Instead, he had survived, had been captured, had been treated according to international law, had been educated by his captors, and was now returning home with a completely transformed understanding of the world. The night before his departure, several of the prisoners gathered to discuss what they had learned and how they would apply it upon return to Japan. Nakamura spoke about the economic rebuilding that would be necessary, about the need to learn from American industrial organization while adapting it to Japanese cultural context. Tanaka, the corporal who had wept when seeing Las Vegas's lights, talked about the importance of rebuilding with honesty about the past, acknowledging what had been done wrong while moving forward constructively. Yamamoto's contribution to the discussion focused on a specific realization that had come to him during his captivity. He argued that Japan's greatest failure had not been military or industrial, but imaginative. The Japanese leadership had been unable to imagine an opponent fundamentally different from themselves, an opponent with such abundance that it could wage total war while maintaining civilian prosperity, an opponent confident enough in its power to show mercy to defeated enemies, an opponent whose strength came not from discipline and sacrifice, but from creativity and excess. This failure of imagination had led to catastrophically wrong strategic assessments. If Japan's leaders had truly understood what they faced, not just the statistics, but the reality behind those statistics, the war might never have been launched. Or if launched, it might have been prosecuted very differently, with earlier recognition that negotiated settlement was the only rational goal rather than the total victory that had been pursued at such terrible cost. The repatriation ship departed from San Francisco in early August 1946. Yamamoto stood at the rail as the ship pulled away from the dock, watching America recede into the distance. He was returning to a defeated, occupied nation that faced years of hardship and reconstruction, but he was also returning with knowledge and perspective that he hoped would prove valuable in the rebuilding to come. The voyage across the Pacific took 3 weeks. During that time, Yamamoto and his fellow former prisoners discussed their plans, shared their observations, and tried to prepare themselves for what they would find upon return. They knew Japan was devastated, knew millions had died, knew the occupation continued. But they also knew from the letters they had received that rebuilding was underway, that democratic reforms were being instituted, that a different kind of Japan was beginning to emerge from the ashes of the old. When the ship finally entered Tokyo Bay in late August, the passengers crowded the decks to see the homeland they had not glimpsed for years. The devastation was immediately apparent. Vast areas of Tokyo had been reduced to rubble by the air campaign. The harbor facilities showed the scars of bombardment, but there was also activity, ships moving, cranes working, people rebuilding. Yamamoto was processed through a repatriation center that had been established by occupation authorities. He was asked about his wartime service, his treatment as a prisoner, his plans for civilian life. He answered honestly, noting that he had been treated according to international law and had participated in educational programs. The American officer conducting the interview seemed pleased by these responses, made notes, and cleared Yamamoto for release to civilian life. His sister met him at the repatriation center, traveling from Nagasaki to Tokyo for the reunion. They had not seen each other since 1943, before his deployment to the Pacific Theater. She looked older, thinner, marked by hardship, but she was alive, and her letters had prepared him for some of what he would see in post-war Japan. They traveled together back to Nagasaki, a journey that took 2 days on trains that ran irregularly and were packed with passengers. Yamamoto saw Japan as it truly was in late 1946, defeated, impoverished, traumatized, but beginning the long process of recovery. The occupation forces were visible, but not omnipresent, generally maintaining order without the brutal oppression that had been feared. Nagasaki itself was beyond anything Yamamoto had imagined. The atomic device's effects were still visible a year after the attack, buildings reduced to shells, entire neighborhoods simply gone, survivors bearing scars and radiation sickness. His sister's descriptions in letters had not fully conveyed the reality. But here too rebuilding was underway. The occupation authorities had provided materials and expertise. Local survivors were clearing rubble and reconstructing homes. Life was slowly reasserting itself. Yamamoto found work as a translator, his English skills from the prison education program making him valuable to occupation authorities and to Japanese businesses beginning to establish trade relationships. He also began writing, producing articles for newspapers and magazines about his experiences, about what he had learned in captivity, about his vision for a rebuilt Japan. His most influential article, published in a Tokyo newspaper in early 1947, was titled "The Lights of Las Vegas." In it, he described the night drive through the casino district, the shock of seeing such casual abundance, the realization of how thoroughly Japan had misunderstood its opponent. He argued that Japan's future lay not in resentment of defeat, but in learning from it, in adopting the economic systems and civic structures that had made American prosperity possible, in building a peaceful, democratic society that could eventually achieve similar wealth through trade and innovation rather than military conquest. The article generated significant discussion. Some criticized Yamamoto for defeatism, for excessive admiration of the enemy, for failing to acknowledge American atrocities during the war. But many others found his message compelling, particularly younger Japanese who were less invested in the old military ideology and more interested in practical steps toward recovery. Nakamura, the submarine commander turned economist, also returned to Japan and found work in the emerging government bureaucracy that was being rebuilt under occupation supervision. He and Yamamoto stayed in contact, occasionally collaborating on writings and lectures about economic reconstruction. Nakamura's technical expertise and Yamamoto's ability to communicate complex ideas to general audiences made them effective advocates for the economic reforms that were transforming Japanese society. The lights of Las Vegas remained a touchstone in their discussions. Nakamura used the example in lectures to students at Tokyo University, where he taught economics starting in 1948. He would describe Yamamoto's account of that night drive, then explain the industrial and economic foundations that made such display possible. His goal was to help Japanese students understand not just what Japan had lost, but what it could potentially